Unlike the United States, Canada has a far-left socialist price control mechanism that rewards provinces and cities that are fiscally mismanaged. In Canada, provinces are the equivalent of U.S. states, and the U.S. Constitution, in comparison to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, limits the amount of financial damage the federal government can do to a state. If the Canadian voters decide to vote for a far-left socialist federal government, the entire country suffers, whereas in the United States, there is only so much damage their federal government can do to prices. In Canada, their local or municipal governments tend to lean toward the far left, imagining that socialist price control mechanisms are the best way to prevent rental prices from increasing. Because government price controls often lead to shortages of private property in Canada, similar to the U.S., when these local government price controls don't work, their local governments will often seek money from the state, which will then seek money from the federal government to solve the problem. This is where Canada and the U.S. differ significantly, and this is the price control mechanism that fuels Canadian real estate prices higher. The Canadian federal government has the legal right to intervene in local real estate jurisdictions and create various price control mechanisms in hopes of dictating real estate prices. Socialists are anti-capitalists, and being anti-anything or labeling yourself a protester to market pricing, socialists put themselves on the hook to fix prices. Where capitalists believe in trade-offs, socialists imagine that the government or the ruling class should have the ability to dictate market prices. The problem with socialist economic theories is that they can't dictate human behavior. So, for example, if a Canadian socialist creates a rent control law, they imagine that they've solved rising rental prices. The truth is, rent controls, which are simply fancy words for price controls, actually create problems because unless the government plans to make landlords slaves to the state, the landlord can react. Maybe the landlord doesn't want to be a landlord anymore. Maybe landlords stop building housing for the poor and middle class and focus on building housing for the affluent. If you accept the possibility that nationwide in Canada, there is a shortage of landlords who want to house the middle class and poor, because of local government price controls, you then have to ask, why doesn't the Canadian government build more government housing for the poor? As anyone in real estate knows, maintenance of property is very expensive, and private real estate management companies require market pricing to deal with the market behavior of individuals. In a free society, tenants have the right to be destructive, and if the landlord cannot disincentivize this behavior by adjusting the price they charge for rent, because of local or federal rules and regulations, well, then the landlord has to adjust their price or services rendered in different ways. Government-run housing developments have proven to be failures for distinct reasons. Taxes are a form of price control. When the government creates housing, it no longer receives property and other housing-related taxes, and tenants in these government housing developments, because of existing socialist laws, are usually not forced to work, equating to housing being a complete liability to the taxpayers of local jurisdictions. At this point in the year 2024, you observe Canada's current far-left federal government, which has its own housing initiatives. In Canada, they've created a federal price control mechanism called the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, known as the CMHC. This federal government entity sells mortgage-backed securities and provides mortgage insurance for Canadians who would otherwise be ineligible to purchase a mortgage from a private bank. Governments involved in mortgage-backed securities, as well as insurance, are price control mechanisms. Private entities cannot compete with government monopolies. Even if a private entity could compete with the government, why would it? Would you open a security company to compete with the FBI or RCMP? Once you wrap your head around the lack of market pricing in the Canadian housing market, their housing price dilemma starts to make a lot more sense, especially when you compare it to the United States. In 2020, the U.S. voters decided to vote for a far-left socialist president named Joe Biden, who decided to allow mass unvetted migration into the United States. One would imagine this far-left radical stance employed by the Biden administration would lead to U.S. housing prices being far more expensive than Canada's, but this hasn't materialized. One needs only to look at the U.S. Constitution to understand why. The U.S. federal government has its powers limited in comparison to Canada's federal government. In America, state fiscal policies matter, state laws matter, and U.S. states that mirror Canada's fiscal spending tend to have similar results in their cost of living. Meanwhile, the U.S. states that employ fiscal restraint and respect for property rights tend to allow market pricing to dictate housing prices. Yes, you can find overpriced housing markets in the U.S., but it's not a widespread problem like it is in Canada. Because of Canada's federal government's involvement in the housing market, local and federal government price controls are forcing Canadian real estate prices upwards at a much faster pace. Because financial education is omitted from public schools, most people forget that taxes are price controls, minimum wages are price controls, rental controls are price controls, building permits are price controls, regulating energy the government doesn't like are price controls, and price controls create shortages of things. Both Canada and the U.S. have housing shortages, but Canada's housing shortage problem is worse, which is why their housing market is more expensive. On this channel, we discuss price controls in all their forms. Our goal is to get you thinking more clearly so people in authoritative positions can no longer manipulate or steal from you without you knowing about it. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment.